Hi, friends. Today we're going to talk about George Washington Carver. But first, let's go over some of our vocabulary words. A canvas is a piece of material on which someone can paint. Have you ever seen a white canvas and maybe somebody or maybe you painted on it? Our crops, those are vegetables or plants that are grown on a farm for food. So when we go to the grocery store and we see our zucchini and our cucumbers and our corn and our tomatoes, those are crops. They were grown on a farm to give us food. And that is our word for the day, crops. Take a look at that again. Crops is the word that we need to know. A botanist. We're going to talk about a famous botanist today, someone who studies plants. And then botany, that's the study of plants. So a botanist studies plants. They studied botany. All right, do you remember this character, this person, this tall tale that we talked about with Johnny Appleseed? Remember that he went across the country, and what did he do? He planted seeds. You're right. And many years later, the people that were moving into that area had beautiful apple trees to give them food, provide shade, and give them wood. He was very famous because he was very giving. He provided somebody with something. And so today, like I said, we're going to talk about another famous person, and his name is George Washington Carver. And he was a famous botanist. So it says, today you are going to hear about another man who, like Johnny Appleseed, became famous because of his love for plants. He too lived many years ago, though not quite as long ago as Johnny Appleseed. His name was George Washington Carver. He became famous throughout the United States as a botanist, which is a scientist who studies plants. George first developed his interest in plants as a young boy. As a child, George used his free time to explore the forest surrounding his home on a farm in Missouri. He spent many hours roaming the woods, discovering all sorts of wonderful things. George liked to collect things that caught his eye. George was especially curious about the different kinds of plants he noticed during his explorations. He wanted to study these plants further, but he knew that if he pulled them out of the ground and took them back to the cabin, they would die. Why would they die? Remember, if you pluck something out of the ground, it separates the roots, and the plant must have roots in order to suck up the water. So when George found an interesting plant, he would carefully dig it up and remove it from the place it was growing, roots and all, so he could plant it in a special garden close to the cabin. Look at a special garden right there that he's transferring those plants to carefully. George moved plant after plant to this special garden where he looked after each and every plant, watering and caring for them all to make sure they continued to grow. As an adult, George later wrote, I literally lived in the woods. I wanted to know every strange stone, flower, insect, bird, or beast. Day after day, I spent time in the woods alone in order to collect my floral beauties and put them in my little garden I had hidden in the brush not far from my house. Fascinated by plants in this garden, George spent hours tending, observing, and studying them. In time, he came to learn about the special needs of plants and how much water each needed, whether it grew best in full sunlight or with some shade. George also took a special interest in caring for plants that were not growing well. He became so skillful at caring for these sick plants that people throughout the neighborhood began to call him the plant doctor. George's passion for plants led him to develop another talent, that of an artist. Of course, his favorite subjects to paint were his beloved plants. Though he did not have a proper canvas or paints, he improvised with what he could find. George made his first paints from different plant parts. He mashed bark, roots, and wild berries together and used them to paint on old boards or even flat rocks. George continued to paint throughout his entire life. George was truly a remarkable and talented person. He was an excellent student who learned quickly. He went on to study at college, eventually becoming an expert in botany, the study of plants. After he finished college, George became a professor at a famous university in Alabama. There, he spent the rest of his life continuing to study plants and experiment with ways to make them grow better. He discovered many ways to help farmers improve how they grew plants and crops on their farms. Now remember, crops are plants that are grown in large numbers to be used by people. George encouraged farmers to grow crops other than cotton. Do you remember the other day that we saw some crops? We looked at cotton, of course, that we use to make our clothes with, but we also looked at rice and wheat and what was the other one? Rice, and corn. But George Washington Carver encouraged farmers to look at peanuts and sweet potatoes for their crops. He also found many ways to use peanuts in all different types of products like dyes and oils and makeup. He even came up with a number of recipes for foods that used peanuts. George Washington Carver is especially remembered today for these discoveries. Now, in this story, we heard the word crops. And we heard it explained as crops are plants that are grown in large numbers for people to use. The farmer grew wheat and corn crops for people to eat. What other types of plants do you think could be grown as crops? Now remember, in class we talked about different types of crops. Some people said strawberries and potatoes and blueberries and apple trees. Like if you went to Apple Annie's, their crop are their apples and peaches and pumpkins. If you go to the pumpkin patch, of course, their crop is pumpkins. But you could have any type of fruit or vegetable as a crop. Corn on the cob, green beans, soybeans, lettuce, radishes, rutabagas. Do you remember talking about those crops today in class? What's the word we were talking about? Crops. The farmer grew wheat and corn crops for people to eat. All right, my friends, I can't wait to see your seesaw activity where you draw a picture of what crop you would plant. Thanks so much.